Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip. Episode 324. When you're missing a certain type of experience in your career, how exactly do you get it? Daniel Lemire said he was missing that enterprise experience that would allow him to apply the things he learned from pursuing a graduate degree. This week, you'll hear the story of what happened after he got that experience. Daniel is an AI consultant at ServiceNow, and he's back for part 2 of our discussion. If you missed part 1 of our discussion in episode 323, we talked about Daniel's reasons for pursuing management information systems in the first place, why he chose to go into independent consulting after college, and the reasons he went back to get a graduate degree. We also shared some concepts from product management, like the idea of a minimum viable product that we can iterate on over time, and this is exactly what Daniel started to do with his career early on. And you'll see him continue to do it this week. This week in part 2 of our discussion, you'll hear about a pattern of continued openness to opportunities that led Daniel to work with larger and larger companies and finally get that enterprise experience he was looking for. You'll hear what it was like to start as a contractor, progress to a build engineer, and then all the way to technical lead. There's an interesting parallel process that you'll hear in this discussion of gaining technical expertise and reputation while also observing the actions of the enterprise organization as a whole through the lens of that graduate degree. Let's get you to part 2 of our discussion with Daniel Lemire.
And the other thing that it did for me was it gave me a much better appreciation of how businesses worked. The challenge was I didn't have the context of experience to put with it. Let me dive into that a little bit more. We had the marketing education, we had the managing education, we had the technical details. And so we're having the conversation about what the CIO is making a decision about and the kinds of questions he's going to ask. And we have these guest speakers that come to us that are in the corporate world, and they give us presentations so we can have some better context in getting the degree. But I knew what the right questions were, but I didn't understand why those were the right questions. And it was a real challenge for me because I couldn't place what I was learning in my brain. I was learning the right things. They really were the right things, but I didn't know what to do with it. The curriculum I took in getting the master's degree was exactly what I needed to be successful in a large enterprise. Mm-hmm. But because I had only done the independent consulting, I had only ever worked with very small companies, like companies that had less than 100 employees. I forget what the law is, but there's a law in management or knowing people, right? Once you get beyond 150 people, it's difficult or impossible to maintain a personal relationship with those individuals, and you have to do very different things from a business management perspective. And I never hit that level. And so much of what I was learning about management discipline and program development and project management was for these really big organizations. And I didn't have the context to understand why all of those things were necessary. Like they told us, here's how you run this big program. And I'm thinking to myself, well, you just write down what you're going to do and you do it, right? It didn't make any sense to me. I didn't understand why all of that other stuff was necessary, but I needed all of that curriculum to be successful when I eventually wound up in an enterprise level career. And there was some steps in between there, but when I finished that graduate degree, I came out with three important understandings about the world. One, I was able to compare myself to the other people that were in the room that were active in their current career. And I discovered through our conversations and our projects that I really did have the aptitude, that I was actually pretty good at this stuff and that I was in the right place. That was the first critical thing. The second critical thing was I knew that I had a lot to learn and I was really missing that enterprise experience. That's something that I really needed to get the full value out of everything I'd learned in getting the graduate degree. And then the third piece of it that I didn't understand until much later was that journey of taking turns between being overprepared for something and getting into something that you're overwhelmed by. That's yet another dichotomy because in some ways, by getting the graduate degree, I was overprepared for an enterprise environment. But from an interpersonal and from a political and from just, being one of many in a corporation, I was totally unprepared for that experience because everything I had ever done up to that point was at a much smaller place. When I was at the Conroe Medical Education Foundation, I was the only IT guy. And there was, 20 people or so that worked there. That was very small. Then I worked with a lot of smaller companies doing websites, a custom construction company here, a medical doctor over here, a musician over there. And probably the biggest deal I had was with a medical services company that had like 80 employees. And that was big to me because I was helping them with their website. And as I'm working through all of that and I'm finishing my grad degree, I'm walking back to my car after one of my courses, the last semester of my grad degree. As I'm walking to my car, this gentleman walks up to me and I knew him. And I don't remember why he was on campus at the time, but he was the systems administrator at the Texas Woman's University Police Department. And he had another role that he was moving into and he was trying to find a good backfill. And he and I knew each other not very closely, but, sometimes you find somebody else that's technically good and you know who they are and you remember them. And this was kind of one of those deals where he was looking out for somebody to fill that role. And we had that chance meeting in person. We were going opposite directions. And he says, "Hey, are you open to something new or different?" And I said, "Well, yeah, because I'm doing this grad school thing while I'm kind of just paying the bills, doing the consulting thing." So I was ready to take on another opportunity. So then I wound up spending a year at TWU and helping them with things. I learned about a totally different kind of business, doing police business. So I was in the back of the police station talking to the police officers and understanding the things that they did. During my time there, I built some systems for the university. So they had the on-campus parking system. I built a way for you to buy your parking permit on the website at TWU. I was very proud of that. Now, I didn't build the whole thing. We worked with the parking ticket vendor, but I integrated a system, and that was my first experience integrating a system. Things that weren't necessarily supposed to go together that we made work. Fast forward a little bit, I worked on a number of different interesting projects and systems, just solving problems. Like there was no guidebook for the things that I did. That integration of the parking system, you couldn't read a manual to learn how to do that. Another big project I did for the university was you needed an alert system for the university. They needed to acquire a system for that, but needed an answer that was immediate. And so I put together some scripts that would basically launch a web page and display alert on the screen and read a phone number out. So if we had like a tornado emergency on campus, they could notify the entire campus immediately. So I built a custom system for that sort of as a stopgap until they found a vendor to solve that problem. That was another one of those things where there's no guide for this. I just know what the technology can do and I know what my skill set is. And we put the things together and built something that solved an immediate issue. So I had a lot of fun. But again, even TWU, as large as it was, I was just in the police department. So that was a big place, but my place inside of that big place didn't take advantage of everything I'd learned in getting the grad degree. So I'm doing my thing at TWU. I'm wrapping up the grad degree, and one of my colleagues from my undergraduate education calls me up We were gaming buddies, so every now and then we'd get online, we'd play a round of Battlefield 1942 or Warcraft 3 because that was the stuff that we enjoyed playing together.
I knew that this was going to benefit you at some point, right? The gaming.
You're so right. It keeps coming back to that. That's interesting, isn't it? He says, I've got this job at PepsiCo and I'm really enjoying it. I think you would be a great person to come over and help us with a project that we're doing. We're looking for a contractor that can load the operating system onto a server and ship it out to the site. Now, I know what all of that means now, but I had no idea what he was talking and why he was being nebulous about it. I knew how to load Windows. Like, yeah, that's something I could do. It wasn't Windows, by the way. We'll come back to that in a second. I said, yeah, well, that's kind of interesting. Tell me more. And so he gives me the number of the lady that's doing the recruiting. And I have a phone call conversation with her. And, we're talking about salary. And of course, I'm throwing out numbers because I know what I'm worth, but I don't know. Is she going to balk at this number that I'm throwing out? Sure enough, the number I threw out there, she's like, yeah, that's in the ballpark. We can work with that. And now I'm getting excited because this is a 40-hour-a-week job and I'm going to be making more money than I've ever known. And she says, great, I'll have the gentleman call you next Tuesday at such and such time to do the interview. Great. I get on the phone with the guy to have the interview and he's asking me questions. We're 4 or 5 questions in and he says, well, how do you feel about working on Saturdays and Sundays? And I said, well, I got to be honest with you. I'm very active in my church and in Sundays, that's just not going to work for me. Then he asked a few more questions and we closed off the conversation. 2 days later, I hear back from the recruiter later and she says, Daniel, this isn't going to work out because this actually is a weekend job. And I didn't know that. Like that wasn't disclosed in the conversation she and I had or in the job description details that were in front of me. I was just answering the questions honestly because that's what the right thing to do was. Well, that job didn't work out for me because they wanted a schedule and I'm not going to sign up for something that I can't follow through with. And I'm not going to give up doing my church activities because that was very important to me at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I still wanted to make a lot of money, but I don't know, for whatever reason, I stuck to my guns on that. Fast forward, it was probably 2 or 3 months. And I get the same recruiter lady calls me up and she says, we have another position that I think you might be really good for that's available. And I said, well, tell me more. It's actually even a little bit better in terms of pay, and it's doing the systems engineering things that I've been doing, not just loading an operating system onto a server. What I find out through the course of the interview process is this job is actually working on the same team as my friend that told me about, hey, you might want to come over here and work at PepsiCo. So he recuses himself from the interview process because we're friends and he doesn't want to be a corrupted vote. So we go and have the interview and I really actually hit it off with the guy that was one of the big decision makers. We just really lined up and within 3 days, they're like, yeah, we want you to come and do the job. It happened really fast when it happened. The next thing you know, I'm working for PepsiCo as a systems engineer, doing Windows automation, loading and running the Windows Server automation load. Now, I was one of the analysts. I wasn't the lead guy. I had to learn a lot of things that I didn't know anything about. They're asking me questions about RAID controllers, and I'm getting it mostly right, but not completely right because that wasn't where I spent all my time. I was still doing a lot more coding than I was hardware things. But I knew enough about hardware to pass all of the fundamental questions. And that then was a huge opportunity for me because I got to get into something that was completely new. The hardware focus was something that I wasn't used to. I did that sort of as an also-ran. Like you need a server, so you got to figure out what specs you need and order it. You're not building the server. You're not making the decisions about comparing the components or the various vendors. Because like at TWU, there was a provider. Like you didn't decide who you're going to buy the server from. The university used Compaq or Dell or HP, and that decision was made for you, right? So I got to go deep into something that I felt was going to advance my career because I didn't know enough about hardware. I got to work on a team inside of an enterprise, and I really wanted that enterprise experience after I got the grad degree because I had all of this stuff in my head that I couldn't really quite use yet. And then the third opportunity for me in getting this job was the paycheck, quite honestly. Like I couldn't say no because it was just such a leap ahead. That was a real turning point for me on many levels because my wife and I were able to buy a house. was able to get the stability that we needed to feel comfortable about doing the family discussion. I was in an organization that had just opportunities everywhere. Well, if you could get in and do well, you were on a career journey, not just a job.
Let's pause there for just real quick. There's an element to one of your 3 takeaways from the grad program that I think played out in everything you just said. So before, when you were just doing the consulting, you weren't around other people who were doing the same kind of work as you to see if you were kind of on par with them, other than these mentors who gave you advice, right? People who were highly skilled. You were a little bit early career, but put you in a room with people studying the same kinds of things, seeing that, okay, I'm not so different from them. It's like a validation point that I belong here. I can do this at a larger scale. You sort of already felt like you could, but I feel like there's a level of confidence that may have come from being in the room with those other people that catapulted you through these interview processes and diving into the new areas. That's my reflection back of what you were sharing.
I think you're spotting something that's very important, because what I've come to understand with the journey that I've been on the last couple of years is how essential that confidence is in being able to get you to the next thing. It is absolutely possible to be overconfident, and I could give you a list of people that I've met in my life that are overconfident and how it has caused real problems for them. And perhaps because of the sensitivity to those people, I was always probably overly cautious about the necessity of having that level of confidence. So I think your perception of that is spot on. And I didn't understand any of that in the situation, but reflecting back on it now, you're 100% right. Finding the way to get yourself the self-confidence so that you can convey what you know to other people enables you to explain the value that you can create for them. And that's how we do business together.
Yeah. And there's this element of feedback too, because even from the beginning of your story, you got feedback from your teacher and other people on your talents and abilities. And I think you would enjoy this. And I know that you're interested in this. And you had friends and colleagues who, I mean, it's like the next iteration of the same feedback pushing you in this direction. Okay, Daniel's the guy. He likes this. I think he's talented enough. So I'm going to encourage him to go and do the thing.
As I look back at it, there's some key things that happened for me on that feedback journey. And again, I didn't go out looking for it, right? But if you asked me about it now, I would expressly tell you that feedback is probably the most important element of being successful. It's going to give you an early warning sign when you're on the wrong path, and it's going to push you in the right direction when you're on the right path. And thinking back to some of the things that I read over my career, there was a book I was reading when my wife and I were dating, and the advice in that dating book was only date people that you're serious about, because otherwise you're wasting your time. And feedback is the way to prevent you from wasting your time.
I like what you said about I didn't necessarily ask for this feedback. It was unsolicited from other people, and it was very positive. I've listened to various podcasters who are quite successful at marketing their show, growing it, whatnot, and they say things like, well, if you're not getting any feedback, whether it's good or bad, that's probably a bad sign.
Yes. And in fact, the sooner you can recognize that that's a problem you have, the sooner you can make a correction. But the flip side of that, Nick, I talked about this on the YouTube broadcast just a few days ago. I have a whole bunch of Post-it notes above my desk here. I have the benefit of working from home.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is making notes to myself, just taking advantage. Like, you can't see any of that, but it's there for my own edification or confidence or information, if you will. One of the stickies is, what experiments are you doing? And the reason I ask myself that question is that in the absence of feedback, you can do experiments and see and evaluate yourself. Is this moving me in the right direction? Just trying something new or different, because the reality is it creates the delta between what you're doing and what you could be doing. reaching back to what you said, this idea, if you're not getting any feedback, right? If you are changing things, generally you're going to get a response. Like either somebody's really going to like it or they're really going to hate it. But either way, you're going to get some feedback.
Yep. I really like that. The ability to experiment.
The corollary to what you just said was like, if you're not getting feedback, maybe that means nobody cares enough about what you're doing. Even if they care negatively, like, oh, you're so wrong about this, at least somebody cares enough to, I don't know, criticize or even get angry, which can help set you on the right path, as opposed to nobody caring. Whatever ripples you are making are not enough to matter to anybody.
I like that. Whatever you're doing, make a ripple.
You're finally in the environment that you can apply all these lessons and concepts to, because it gives you the context of where those methodologies came from. And once you got there, did you immediately think back, oh, now I can apply all this knowledge I have? Or did it take you a while to have those click together?
Man, I really love this question. I can tell you, Nick, that basically from the moment I landed, everything started to make sense about that grad degree immediately. I felt like I was Superman and had X-ray vision because everywhere I looked, the pieces were fitting together. I could understand how the manager's manager was making a decision and why the CIO said what he said. I'd go to the town hall meeting and I'd see what the corporate people were saying and how they were saying it. And everything fit together so well. The part that I didn't appreciate about knowing all of that was the engineer in me was also immediately frustrated because I could see where things were broken and I wanted desperately to be able to fix them. And the thing about an enterprise environment is there's a lot that has to happen before you get to a level that would let you move the chess pieces in any appreciable way. You kind of have to show up as the pawn on day one and make sure that you're executing your area of responsibility so you can build credibility to be able to speak up when that opportunity eventually does come around. I'm delighted to say that that was the easy part. Being good at the thing that I was responsible for was what allowed me to consistently exceed the objectives that were handed to me. And to a large degree, they were handed to me. It wasn't a lot, especially in the early days of making any kind of decision about how things were going to work. It was just, this is what we need to accomplish, go get it done. So that was a great opportunity for me because I just kept my head down. And the fun part of that was, I'd go spend my day in the lab working on the server build, writing code, rebooting systems, and making things work. And I was also a contractor in the very early days. So I was left out of the politics. Like, that wasn't my role. That wasn't anything anybody was ever going to ask me. And in fact, candidly, as a contractor, you keep your nose out of that stuff because that's only ever going to get you in trouble, poking your nose in places that you have no credibility and no responsibility and no political will to exercise. But being able to do well and just be helpful to the people immediately around me, if there was a problem and I could show up and help, I did. And that earned me a reputation that also got me over the next hurdle, which was about a year and a half into my work at PepsiCo. They had a situation where, as a contractor, you were either let go or you were taken up as an employee. And I got to be in the group that was taken up as an employee because I had sufficiently demonstrated my value. That gave me just a little bit of wiggle room on negotiations, so I didn't have to take the first offer they threw at me, which again was a tremendous benefit and opportunity. I count that time as a contractor as my time at PepsiCo because really the things that I was working on were my responsibility. Like, I owned the thing that I was given. In some ways, I look back at that and I now understand why so many of my colleagues were like, you don't know how good you have it as a contractor. Because as a contractor, you don't have to deal with the politics. You just do your work and you do it well and you go on. But I also really wanted to be that employee because I really enjoyed working at PepsiCo, getting to work in the big things and being in the data center, seeing the walls of computers and understanding what a big enterprise organization can accomplish. And being a part of that story was something that I definitely wanted. I knew that there was a lot of opportunity ahead in terms of leveraging that graduate degree, doing technical things that needed to be done, and growing myself, because that was also something that was clear, that there were investments in me as an employee, and I wanted that. I wanted that additional training. I wanted that opportunity to grow and get better.
And was that your way of answering the question that someone from church asked about what's the extra thing you're doing
Yes.
to make you better? Or I forget the way you phrased it, but it had something to do with looking forward to what's next and not just what you're doing right now.
Yeah, looking ahead and having a little bit of a vision for what you want to take on so that you're not standing still. The better way that I like to explain that these days is borrowing the concept of entropy from physics. Entropy basically tells us if you're standing still, you're degrading. You're always in some phase of change. So if you have any control at all, make sure that your phase is going up and not down, because if you're not paying attention to it, entropy is playing on the system and things are going to naturally degrade.
It's interesting, though, that you had this advanced degree, which was preparing you. Usually what those degrees prepare you for is like high-level individual contributor roles or management and leadership roles. So you get all this insight into that, but then your very first experience with an enterprise is at one of the largest enterprises, which, large enterprises have large enterprise momentum. The container ship analogy, you can't turn on a dime, right? There's a lot of time and effort that it takes to move things in a direction that they're not already moving. How did you see that, or did that affect your experience there?
That's a really great question I'm excited to talk about, because even though I was in that early position without any responsibility for other individuals or a program, it was very much an individual contributor role where I stayed in my lane and did the things that needed to be done because I knew what to do with that. But the graduate degree gave me the context. And so no matter what the situation was, I was able to kind of read the tea leaves a little bit and see what was going on behind the scenes. In any sufficiently large environment, there are the official things, the things that everybody says because it's what they have to say or it's the dialogue they have to carry through. Then there are the things behind the scenes that are the real actual games that you're playing, and there's a whole different set of rules that are associated to that. And the sooner you can understand the difference between the rules they say they're using and the rules they're actually using, the more likely you are to be successful. And to me, that graduate degree gave me the tools I needed to understand not just what was said, but what was not said and what that meant for me. So even though I didn't have that responsibility, I could see the things that were being done from an organizational perspective and translate that into being able to decipher what the bigger next move was. Because in my individual contributor role, I knew we needed to iterate the build and we needed to support the new feature or the new equipment. We had to, achieve a certain schedule with getting the next model number incorporated into the build release so that we could stay ahead of the refresh cycle and so forth. But the bigger things, like where the technology strategy of the organization was and how the business people saw the technology organization and why they saw it that way, was something I was able to observe. And what was really valuable about that was I was able to see both the good and the bad from a position that I could learn a lot without having to carry any of the responsibility about making those decisions. And I think that was really the thing that shot me ahead from my enterprise career perspective, was I was able to gather a lot of information in a very short period of time because I was able to contextualize it with the graduate degree, where some of my peers that I talked to inside the organization didn't have that graduate degree, and they had trouble making sense. In fact, oftentimes it created frustration because they didn't understand why decisions were being made certain ways about things. While I didn't necessarily agree with it, I could contextualize it and understand how it could be that way.
Did you find yourself trying to explain some of the things you knew and the way you read the tea leaves to your colleagues? Or did you feel like maybe that wasn't really your place and would seem too assumptive about what was happening in the organization?
I wasn't hesitant so much in a one-on-one. If I had the opportunity behind the scenes to have a candid conversation with somebody, I did it. I was reticent of that in a corporate atmosphere. So if there was an entire team or if it was a senior leader, I held my tongue. Was that the right thing to do? I don't think so. I think I could have created a lot more value by providing some of that analysis back. But that's also with the hindsight of looking back and knowing that I did have some of the right ideas. But what I didn't have that I now fully comprehend is I didn't know how to say things in a way that would be received well. In other words, my early days, while I was good at providing critical feedback, it was critical feedback. I didn't know how to say things in a way that was polite or non-destructive. And, honestly, guys, one of the other challenges that I have still is because of some of the very difficult situations that contributed to my analysis of, I know what the right thing to do is, can't we just do this, led to me internalizing some frustration, and that has come out in my tone sometimes. I have to be really careful still that I don't put myself in a situation where I'm overly stressed or frustrated, because when that comes out, the conversation doesn't go well. It's not good for me. And I had some critical moments in my career where I had some very critical feedback and I let it out in a way that was not constructive or useful. And that limited what I could do from a career perspective. That's one of those things where it's like, I knew the right thing to do, but I didn't know how to convince others or how to use that information in a way that was persuasive or valuable to someone else. So it's kind of one of those double-edged swords, like don't bite your tongue unnecessarily, but at the same time, be sure that you can say it in a way that is constructive and helpful.
And probably in a forum too, right?
Yes. I think that is the other thing that came clear to me from talking with some of my other colleagues. As they matured in their careers, they were figuring those things out and they were sharing them with me. The advantage of having those peers was being able to bounce things off of each other. And one of the cool things that happened was, and I alluded to it earlier, there are people in the office and you immediately recognize who really knows their stuff. And you seek those people out. This is where being really, really good at what you do is so important, because it leads to new opportunities that you don't have access to, because people seek you out as that expert. And that's why you have to balance the doing the things that you're not good at and exercising the things that you are good at. If you get too far into the doing things that you're not good at, it lessens the number of opportunities that you have. So you have to be really strategic about diving into the deep end too far. You have to continue to do the things that you're not good at, but do it in a way that leverages the things that you are, so you don't get into the red zone. That's one of the things that I've learned, and we'll touch on that a little bit later as we get into the more specific elements of the career. But the very first thing I took away from that experience was find the right people and talk to them on a one-on-one basis for two reasons. One, you get to test out what you are seeing, and they're going to respond to that. And two, you're going to identify who you can work with well and take advantage of that later on in your career. Because finding great people is a huge career builder.
Build champions for your brand.
That is true everywhere. We talk about it a lot in the creator space because you have to market yourself, but that is true for your career, and you have to be able to tell someone in a very short period of time what your value is, and that is your brand. No matter what you're doing, no matter how large or small the organization is, you do have to think about that to some degree and have a plan for that. That's something I lucked myself into. Everything that I'm just describing, I can look back at it and go, oh yeah, I did the right thing there and I did the right thing over there. But I didn't understand at the time that that's what I was doing.
That makes sense to me. And I think that most people, I'm going to make a generalization here, do not know how to succinctly articulate the value they bring to a situation, job, role without some real reflection, practice interviewing, writing, iterating on that, really thinking about the experiences they've had. some feedback from other people, perhaps? Because they'll know, right?
There's that feedback again. Also, there's so many ways that you can do that I was not taking advantage of. I was having those interpersonal conversations and getting that feedback. What I wasn't doing was thinking about my resume and what I needed to do to put things onto that list. One of the benefits of being in a corporation was every year we had to do objectives. So that was helping me to build the resume because every year you had to put some thought into, okay, what am I going to accomplish? Whether it was given to you or not, it was a very clearly stated thing. And you could say, I did it or I didn't. And here's how I did in accomplishing that thing. But again, I was going through the motion that was given to me. It wasn't something I was doing because I thought it was the right thing to do. That is one of the benefits of a large organization. They have to build systems for their survival. So there are things that have to be done in order for the organization to be successful. Everybody kind of grumbles about objectives a little bit because they're like, yeah, they're going to make me write it down and I have to follow it. And they're giving me all these things that I don't know anything about that I have to follow. But I can honestly say with reflection that that's one of the best things an organization does for their employees because it forces you to do something that will make you better, whether you want it to or not. And it's a thing that is, I believe, completely necessary. And if you're in a position today where you're not given that system, the best thing you can do for yourself is to literally write it down. What are you going to do? And then look at it again multiple times to ask yourself, what am I doing about that? And how did you do so far? The most successful people write it down. They think about it, they talk about it, and they write it down and then evaluate it later. And that is so essential. And I didn't really appreciate that until just recently.
I went through a process as I came on to my most recent gig where, we were asked to do the process of objectives and key results, OKRs. And it's something that we also did at Google when I was there. And, in a little bit more of a leadership position, it's a little bit tougher to take OKRs from an upstream person and then recontextualize them for the team that you are on and, the kind of downstream team members, and to give them something to say, this is how I'm measuring my next year or next whatever time period, these objectives and key results are valid for. It's a very interesting thing. And I think you're also very right to say it's also like a great resume builder. The organization is helping you articulate how you are being measured over the next, year or whatever. And it's exactly what you can put on your resume. This is how I was measured, and this is how I did. These are the steps that I took to accomplish that.
I want to jump on that a little bit further. That translation of what you get, the word I've only ever been exposed to is cascade, that giving you the things that you're responsible for. And then especially if you're a manager, right, trying to give that and relate that to the people that you're responsible for helping and supporting. I will admit that, one of the hardest things about my career thus far was when I was in that manager role and I had to do that translation. I really struggled with that. And I'm not even sure that I'm really great at it today, but I also understand that whether or not you're great at it, you have to do it, because if you are not doing it, the people that you're responsible for supporting and helping don't get the context that they need for why it is that they're doing what they are doing. It's very easy to ask them, hey, I'm going to give you this thing, you find a way to improve it. But just improving yourself in a vacuum, in a silo, is actually one of the biggest roadblocks to organizational success. Because what happens is we compartmentalize. We get really good at building our individual mechanism, and then it doesn't interface well with the rest of the machine that we know as the organization. And that's what a critical manager does, is they make sure that the individual is able to grow and carry through the responsibilities, but to do it in a way that it doesn't jeopardize the rest of the system. So in some ways, you might say that those middle managers are the transmission that connects the engine to the wheels. You can have a great engine, but if it never gets connected to the wheels, you're not going anywhere. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we face today with many of the changes that we're seeing in the corporate world, what I see with AI, for example, there's a lot of folks that are really excited about how much they can do. And while it's very empowering to the individual, one of the things we have to be really careful of is wanting to jump into that new thing and make myself more effective, but not thinking about the larger organizational impacts that that's going to have. What I mean specifically about that is one of the things you see with the programmers, like you'll get a senior developer that can really do amazing things empowered by AI, building really great applications. Oftentimes, they're sourcing things to an AI that they would traditionally have done for a junior developer. And if you're not working directly with that junior developer, you're also not building that junior developer into a senior developer. And that will have an impact of its own later on. And so the other thing that as individual contributors and managers that we should all be thinking about is, how do I optimize for today without putting myself in a difficult situation for tomorrow? We have to think about both the short and the long term, and we have to help the rest of the organization do that as well. That's probably the challenge for the next decade as we get the most advanced technology the man has ever seen and try to put that together with humans.
Sure. You were talking about the challenges of taking on the manager role. Can we pick that apart and how you ended up progressing there and reasons for taking it on?
The first step was going from that individual contributor working on one thing to having a responsibility for multiple things. So the first step was moving from being a build engineer to being what's the term?
Technical lead, team lead?
Yeah, technical lead, where you don't have responsibility for the other people, but you have to find a way to get people's work to come together in a way that is valuable so that you're expanding what you're able to do beyond yourself. That was a very natural progression for me because, again, as we've talked about before, that looking around you and seeing, okay, yeah, I'm actually really good at this. And as I was observing the systems and the way that things were happening, that sort of led to naturally trying to persuade some of the other members of the team about how they should go about things, like being able to observe things and influence the direction of the work that they were doing and how they were thinking about things. One of my favorite professors in college, we were in the middle of the learning how to do COBOL, and some of the other folks in the class were getting caught up in some of the small details. And his comment to the class was, couldn't see the forest for the trees. And of course, I didn't know what that meant when he said it. Some of the guys in the class kind of chuckled when he said that. And I kind of looked around like, what is he saying? But he explained it. He said, you're focusing too much on the little details and not thinking about what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And that's what kept happening in our technical conversations. Like one of my colleagues would be super focused on this one little piece. And I kept saying, okay, let's step back and think about the bigger picture here and how it fits together. And that just sort of kept happening. It was just a natural progression to where I was helping them with those individual things that they needed to accomplish, but also helping to make things mesh more easily as we had to put things together, because I was consistently finding myself in this situation where I had to negotiate the interface between the work that we were doing and the value that it was creating. I didn't understand that at the time, but that's actually what I was doing now, reflecting back on it. It was seeing where, yeah, you could tweak that function again for the 1,000th time, but that's not going to get the server built any faster. Exercising your technical acumen is great, and we all want to do things high quality and the best that we can, but there is a time that you have to recognize that the optimization you're making isn't going to improve the system. And if we don't improve the system, the value is not being generated. You know, a lot of that contextualization that I talked about just there is really where I spent that middle decade in my career. I was at PepsiCo for not quite 16 years. The first couple of years was getting orientated from a technical perspective and then finding ways to contribute to the team. The natural career progressions of the people around me gave me opportunities to move up. And so when I had an opportunity to raise my hand and say, I want that, I did it. And then that led to my manager recognizing my talent and then looking out for opportunities to put me in because they understood that I was capable and that if they gave it to me, it would get done well. And that made things better for them, and that made things better for me. What was great about being that technical lead was that I didn't have to deal with any of the HR kind of things that had to be done. That limited my growth from a manager perspective, but it enabled me to do some really great things that I'm very, very proud of. I don't have any regrets about not moving into that manager space sooner because, again, as I mentioned with the grad degree, I was able to observe all of that without having to be responsible for it. For me, that responsibility is a mantle that I want to put on, but when I do put it on, it is something that weighs me down. There is a cost for me in taking on that. I take it very seriously because you're talking about caring for other people and making sure that they're doing the right thing. So the good thing was I was able to stay in that technically focused contributor role for quite a long time. I didn't have to take on the responsibility of being somebody's manager. I was just there to support them from a technical perspective, help them grow themselves from a technical path and make good decisions for their career without having the mantle of responsibility there. But what changed as my career grew is the macro things inside the organization. So the organizational strategy began to affect my trajectory. The first place that hit was there was a lot of outsourcing that was going on. Every couple of years, there'd be fewer of the people that I was used to working with because things were being shifted around, in large part due to globalization and optimization. And that really made me grumpy. I didn't like that because in many ways it made my job more difficult, right? Those technical people that I had made deep connections with, that I could leverage those relationships to get my work done, kept disappearing. And so I'd have to reset. I'd have to go find somebody new. And oftentimes that somebody new was not only somebody that I couldn't relate to because they weren't next to me, but there were also additional cultural differences and location differences that made that more challenging.
Dunbar's number again?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Now, that's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, you build those relationships you know you can trust, and because of the dynamic, they go somewhere else, you're building your network. Like every person you have a good rapport with that goes somewhere else, that creates totally new avenues of opportunity for you. But I didn't appreciate that part of it at all because I was very happy being at PepsiCo. Like I was like, I can be here for a long time, having a great career. It doesn't matter where those people went; they're not here anymore. While I was frustrated that good people were finding themselves on the other end of the ticket, I had work to do, and so I was just focused on what I needed to get done. I couldn't get emotional about that because there wasn't anything I could do about it. But it was building my frustration in ways that I didn't understand or appreciate. And you have to be really careful with that. One of the things that we do generally as guys is the compartmentalization. You know, the analogy that I've heard is the men are waffles and women are spaghetti. I'm very much a waffle. Like I've got these bins and work is here and personal is here. We try to do that. That's not real life. The truth is, and if there were any wisdom I could share, it would be don't think about just work or just family. Sit down and think about all of the elements of your life and figure out how they're going to fit together. Because if they don't fit together, it'll come around to bite you later.
It's funny, I've never heard that analogy before, but it certainly does fit, like especially the extremes, right? We think that we're like waffles made out of titanium, but in real life, waffles leak syrup and butter through, and you find stuff like, oh, I thought that was compartmentalized. Like, nope, the syrup that was over there, we got it over here too.
Yeah, it leaked into another compartment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so as that progression continued, eventually it got to a point where it directly affected me. The critical decision was made by the organization to essentially outsource all of the infrastructure services space. That was a really challenging time for me in my career because I had built all sorts of great technical systems that I was very proud of, that I thought were very effective. And I literally had to hand those over to somebody that I'd never met before. And it was to the point where my management team actually said to me at one point, Daniel, you don't do that work anymore. That's not yours. That's not your job. Your job is to make sure the things get done, not how they get done. And I had a really hard time with that. There were some practical realities to needing to approach things that way simply because of the business agreements that were in play and where the work was getting done and how that was being prosecuted. But a big part of my pride was the work that I had produced. And essentially what that meant to me was that the work that I had done, that I had spent, the better part of a decade to be effective at, really was not valued. The elements of the contractual agreements basically meant that all of that effort was going to no longer appreciably create value for the organization. There was a time of struggle there for me, and that began the sort of searching mode, going back to the very early experience where I found out, okay, that's not where I'm going to be now. Now what? And it was because I recognized that what I was doing was no longer the path forward. I kind of had to have a reset.
I'm afraid we'll have to cut it there this week. So what do you think? Was gaining enterprise experience exactly the right thing for Daniel? It sure sounded like it. It sounded like that was the place where he belonged. That's what he wanted. That's what he got. And interestingly enough, it wasn't just about doing the work and doing it well. Yes, that was the groundwork for building a great reputation within the company. But he was also observing the things going on within the greater organization, looking at the way decisions were made through the lens of the information he gained from that graduate degree program. He talked about it being both exciting, amazing, but also frustrating because he didn't really have the influence power to change any of those decisions. I think he got the influence at the technical lead level and perhaps beyond that, which we'll hear about in future episodes, by continuing to remain open. He was still open to new opportunities because he was recommended by a friend to work at TWU and then PepsiCo. He kept following that feedback from other people. He was open to what they had to say and what they recommended him for, but as he began to observe the greater organization he was living in, because he was within this big enterprise, an enterprise in which there were a lot of opportunities. So he started looking out for or keeping his eyes open for opportunities that might fit his skill set or that might help him grow. Whereas there weren't really those kind of growth opportunities at the other companies that he had done work for. That's the big difference. But moving up from build engineer to technical lead, at that level, he was starting to make an impact, starting to influence the way changes were made within the organization, even if they were within the purview of a specific technical team impacting one or more systems. It was that influence that I feel like he wanted when he first started and began to understand the organization as a whole. I really like that idea of setting and tracking objectives. Does your company have you do this each year? And if they do, are you spending the time to do it well? Is it something you're getting feedback on from your manager, from your team lead if you have one? Maybe you don't have this kind of system or requirement at your employer. Daniel mentions we can still do this. We can still write down our objectives or our goals and track our progress on the way to get there. And maybe we should track those experiments as well. What is it that we can experiment with that is trackable? You'll be glad you documented it to put on your resume. Even if it's completely unrelated or seemingly unrelated, I think you should still track it for the purposes of trying to connect the dots and looking for anything that might be relatable in that experimentation, even if it's completely outside and unrelated to your work. You might be surprised what relates. When I think about other episodes that go really nicely with some of the things we learned from Daniel in this one, episode 284 with Jason Belk comes to mind. In that episode, he was talking about our career narrative and building a technical portfolio. And all of it starts with documentation. Some of the advice we got from Daniel was documenting our objectives, documenting the work we're doing. That's really, really important. And we've heard it over and over from people who have been on the show. And then I'd also recommend going back and listening to episode 267 with Eric Gross. There was a moment in his naval career after he had learned all sorts of concepts about nuclear engineering, at which everything clicked. And that was the moment when conceptual learning met the concrete learning, or experiential learning, you might call it. It's exactly what I thought of when Daniel finally got to work inside the enterprise and could marry his graduate degree knowledge with what was happening within the organization. So what exactly did Daniel mean about needing to reset after the organization started outsourcing? I'm afraid you'll have to wait for the next installment to get that answer. We'll see you then for part 3.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at BJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios.
I just want to say Dunbar's number.
That's it. You got it. Why couldn't I think of that? Yeah, Dunbar's number. That's the 150 personal relationships number.
I've been waiting for 30 minutes to say that.